This video is our second video on learning approaches and looking at behaviourism. This video is going to be focused on operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is credited to B.F. Skinner, this chap here. And the idea behind Skinner's theory of operant conditioning is that organisms spontaneously produce different behaviours. And these behaviours produce consequences for that organism. Sometimes those consequences are desirable, they're positive, and sometimes they're negative and undesirable. Whether an organism is going to repeat that particular behaviour depends on the nature of these consequences. So this is why we say that operant conditioning is learning via consequences. So if you have a look here, this is Skinner's box. This is a special cage that Skinner developed in order to investigate operant conditioning in rats. So you can see here there's a few features. If you just have a look at the different labels, you can see that the rat is able to freely move around this cage, and when it does, it accidentally presses this lever. When it does press this lever, a couple of things might happen. So in some instances, when the rat presses the lever, a food pellet dispensed from here falls into the cage. And that's rewarding for that rat. So in no time at all, that hungry rat begins furiously pressing that lever in order to obtain more food. In other circumstances, you can see here that the floor has got an electric grid, and this is powered up to a shock generator, which means that this floor is able to deliver an electric current to shock that rat. So if you can imagine other circumstances, again, this rat is exploring around the cage, but while it's doing so, it's receiving a constant electric shock. Now, again, when this rat accidentally stumbles upon this lever here and presses it, that electric shock stops momentarily. So you can imagine then this rat is going to continuously press this lever in order to avoid getting that electric shock. In both circumstances, the rat has discovered that by pressing this lever, its behaviour is going to result in consequences, either receiving a pleasant pellet of food or removing an unpleasant electric shock. And in both cases, that rat is going to continue pressing that lever, i.e. it is learned via the consequences of its actions, the consequence of receiving a pellet of food or the consequence of removing an electric shock. And that's going to, in both cases, increase the frequency of that lever pressing behaviour. So let's have a look at what this means then. So this is looking at reinforcement. So reinforcement means just what that word implies. I.e. it's something in the environment that strengthens or reinforces or increases the likelihood of a particular behaviour being repeated. So it's making a particular behaviour more likely to recur. And there's two main types of reinforcers. There's positive and negative reinforcers. Although in both instances they make it more likely that a behaviour will be repeated, they just do so in different ways. So positive reinforcement occurs when an organism receives, hence positive, a rewarding stimulus following particular behaviours. So for example, the rat in Skinner's box received a pellet of food for pressing the lever, and this increases the frequency of that lever pressing behaviour. And this is because it has received something pleasant, something desirable, and so it's going to repeat that behaviour in order to get more desirable consequences for that behaviour. If we look at negative reinforcement, this occurs in a different way. So rather than receiving something rewarding, this is the removal of something that is unpleasant when the behaviour is performed. So this was for the rat when it pressed the lever, the constant electric shock that it was receiving was avoided. That was removed and it no longer received that electric shock, which in itself is rewarding, not getting shocked. So in both cases, we're increasing the likelihood of that lever pressing behaviour occurring. In positive reinforcement, that increase in frequency of lever pressing behaviour is because the rat received something rewarding or desirable. And in the case of negative reinforcement, the increase in that lever pressing behaviour occurred because the rat was able to avoid something unpleasant. But in both cases, reinforcement means that the behaviour is more likely to be repeated, i.e. it reinforces the behaviour. We also have punishment. So punishment is when there is a consequence for a behaviour that decreases the likelihood of that behaviour being repeated. So this means that the behaviour is the behaviour is followed by a consequence that is undesirable or unpleasant for that organism. So a decrease in the likelihood of that behaviour occurring again. And just like reinforcement, punishment can be positive or negative. So positive means receiving something. So in order for this to decrease the likelihood of behaviour being repeated, this stimulus that must be received by the organism has to be unpleasant. So this could be being told off by your mother, this could be getting a smack or a slap, this could be receiving a detention. You receive something unpleasant, which is going to decrease the likelihood of that behaviour being repeated. But likewise, punishment can also be negative punishment. And in order for us to remove something to decrease the likelihood of behaviour being repeated, we must be removing something unpleasant. So this is like having your toys taken away as a child for being naughty. That is unpleasant, we don't like that, that's undesirable. So we're going to decrease the likelihood of us repeating the behaviour that got our toys taken away. So positive punishment, we receive something unpleasant following undesirable behaviour. And negative punishment, a pleasant experience or a desirable like toys or something, something desirable, something pleasant for us is taken away in order to decrease the likelihood of that naughty behaviour being repeated. We also have different types of reinforcers. So we have primary and secondary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers are biological in nature. They're innately rewarding for us. We don't need to learn that they are rewarding. So for example, food and drink and pleasure are all, we all respond to those innately without having to learn that those reinforcers are pleasurable. Secondary reinforcers, on the other hand, are conditioned because we learn to associate secondary reinforcers with primary reinforcers. So there's learning here. For example, money in itself has no inherent value. It's not rewarding for us. The only reason it is rewarding and is reinforcing of behaviour is because we can trade it in for primary reinforcers, for food, for drink, for pleasurable experiences. Likewise, with tokens, when we look at token economies later on in the A-level, we'll see that in school, if you received a token for good behaviour, or in prisons or psychiatric hospitals, if you receive a token for good behaviour, that token in itself means nothing. It's not inherently valuable or rewarding for us. The only reason that tokens are reinforcing is because we can trade them in for primary reinforcers. We can trade them in for food or for pleasurable experiences like being able to choose the film that's on the television that night. So primary reinforcers are biological and unlearned, whereas secondary reinforcers are learned, are conditioned, because they become associated with that primary reinforcer. So just to recap, this video was looking at operant conditioning and the work of Skinner, looking at types of reinforcement, either positive or negative reinforcement. Both increase the likelihood of behaviour being repeated. And we also looked at punishment, which is, again, either positive or negative, but is a consequence that follows behaviour that decreases the likelihood of that behaviour being repeated. And we've just looked at the different types of reinforcers here as well, primary and secondary reinforcers.